passage, we have the details of David's righteous rule over Israel. To some, this passage may just be boring details, and I doubt that any pastor today who wants to keep his pulpit secure would be spending a Sunday or two on it. But there are some scriptural gems of value there, and we'll go digging for them together. Hi, I'm Ken Godepness, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thanks for joining us as we finish up chapter 8 of the second book of Samuel, studying verses 13 to 18. Verse 13 starts off by telling us David made a name for himself. I suppose that if one won victories as David had just won against the Philistines, the Moabites, Hadadezer, and Arameans, as we read he had in the previous 12 verses of this chapter, that a name would certainly follow him, and a good one at that. And it did, although I believe it was because God was with him and God wanted him to have such a name. Now, the end of that verse in the New American Standard Bible says he was returning from killing 18,000 Arameans. But verse 5 earlier in the chapter talks about his killing 22,000 Arameans. Do we have a conflict here? Was this the same event? Perhaps. One possible explanation is a notation by the New American Standard Bible editors that simply says, quote, some manuscripts read Edom or Edomites here. The NAT, for example, says Edomites. At first, I considered whether the Arameans were Edomites and vice versa, but I could not find any evidence for that in my research. Excuse me. And to support the idea that it was Edomites and not Arameans here, which would take care of the numbers killed controversy, the next verse, verse 14, goes on to say, David put garrisons in Edom, and the Edomites became his servants. Granted, this is very similar wording to verse 6, except that the writer used Arameans, and here he uses Edomites, just a few verses apart. The NAT notes also say that in Hebrew, both Aram and Edom are very similar in spelling, with just one minor differentiation. So this could explain part of our problem as to which it was. That is, an error in transcription. But that does not address the differences in numbers. The end of verse 14 repeats the idea that the Lord helped or protected David wherever he went. And verse 15 gets to the gist of the short paragraph. David reigned all over Israel, administering justice and righteousness for all his people. The NAT says he guaranteed justice for all. I'm not a historian by any means, but I do enjoy history and read it whenever I can. But honestly, I can't remember those words being said about any ruler since David. I'm hoping I'm wrong and ask you to correct me if that's the case. This is what we need today in many countries around the world. A ruler who clearly is being helped by God, knows it, and he's there to administer or to provide and to carry out justice and righteousness for all their subjects, bar none. Oh, how we need that. Sadly, the average ruler today can't really define true justice because he has no absolutes, and he cares little about righteousness as he pays no attention to God. Oh, what a mess we're in. But God is still on the throne. The universe is unfolding as it should, and God's great plan for mankind will be accomplished in the fullness of time. The last three verses of the passage, verses 16 to 18, are an account of some of those who were central to David's administration, his cabinet, if you like. There was Joab in charge of his army. Call him the Secretary of Defense if you like. Robert Jameson ties this particular appointment in with the role that Joab had played in the past, and particularly the promise that David had made in 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 8. You may want to pause the video there and check that out. 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 8. It's amazing how it all jives together. But don't forget to come back. Jehoshaphat was his recorder. This was his historiographer. as they say, or daily analyst, an office of great trust and importance in Eastern countries. Rulers still have similar positions in their administrations today. They're personal historians. Zadok and Ahimelech, as we learn, were two key or high priests. Now you may well ask, why two high priests? Well, again, Robert Jameson comes to the rescue. He writes, quote, on the massacre, or after the massacre of the priests at Moab, 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 19, Saul conferred the priesthood on Zadok of the family of Eleazar, 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 50, while David acknowledged Ahimelech of Ithamar's family, who had fled to him. The two high priests exercised their office under the respective princesses, Saul and David, to whom they were attached. But on David's obtaining the kingdom over all Israel, they both retained their dignity, Ahimelech officiating at Jerusalem and Zadok officiating at Gibeon, 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 39. Sariah was secretary or scribe. Benaiah was assigned to rule over or supervise the Kerethites. These were the Philistines, as we read in Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 5. Both the Vulgate and the NLT, the New Living Translation, translate them as such, and over the Pelethites. These latter men from Pelet, 1 Chronicles 12:3, were the valiant men who, having accompanied David during his exile among the Philistines, were now made his bodyguard. David's sons were his chief ministers or priests. Now the NAT notes are worthy of note here. They say, quote, that David's sons could have been, the fact that David's sons could have been priests, in light of the fact that they were not of the priestly lineage, is indeed strange. One must assume either, one, that the word priest during this period of time could be used in a broader sense of chief ruler, as in the King James Version, or chief minister, as in the ASV and the NASB, or as in royal advisor, the NIV, perhaps based on the parallel passage in 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 17, which has, quote, the king's leading officials, end of quote. Or secondly, that in David's day, members of the king's family could function as a special category of priests, as in priestly leaders, New Living Translation. The latter option seems to be the more straightforward way of understanding the world in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 18. Robert Jameson points out that not only was David a great ruler in foreign affairs and military battles, but he also led his people incredibly well domestically. Certainly this man was blessed of God beyond any doubt. Two final thoughts on this passage. First, we cannot miss the fact that even a great leader like David needed to have great people assisting him, and he had them. We cannot lead alone. God does not want us to lead alone. There are inherent dangers in leading alone. Christian leaders need to bond with great men and women who will lead under God with them. Neglecting to do so puts them at great risk, as we see over and over again, and the world is only too quick to point it out to us. Secondly, we see David preparing his sons and training them in the way of being leaders and contributors to the society. Whether our children follow in our business or career footsteps or not is no reason why we cannot give them as much training as possible in becoming overseers of justice and righteousness in any field they choose. Remember, this was a passage we thought we wouldn't get much out of, but once again, the word surprised us. Join us next time as we learn about David's righteous rule over somebody called Mephibosheth. There were two men with that name in the Bible, and both appear in 2 Samuel. This is a touching story that we'll study as David remembers a promise he had made. In the meantime, we ask you to share these videos with others. Keep on studying the Word of God. Write to us And we also ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems. Till next time.